Now that your husband is gone, pack your bags and leave. This house belongs to us now, my daughter-in-law said across the dinner table, and my son didn't say a word. He simply lowered his eyes and nodded. I thought losing my husband of 36 years was the deepest pain I would ever feel. I was wrong. What happened that evening cut far deeper than grief ever could. I left the table quietly. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply stood, folded my napkin, and walked upstairs. They thought my silence meant defeat. They had no idea it was only the beginning. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I'd love to know how far this story reaches. The dining room felt strangely empty that night. The oak table my husband Richard had built with his own hands seemed larger than usual. The chandelier above us cast a warm glow across the room, but there was nothing warm about the atmosphere. Richard had been gone for only 9 days. 9 days since I stood beside his grave holding a bouquet of white lilies while trying to understand how a person could simply disappear from a life they had occupied for decades. At 70 years old, I believed I understood loss. My parents were gone. Old friends had passed away. Neighbors I once waved to every morning had slowly disappeared from the neighborhood. But losing Richard felt different. It felt as though someone had quietly removed the foundation beneath my feet while expecting me to continue standing. Throughout dinner, my daughter-in-law Vanessa barely looked at me. She spent most of the meal scrolling through her phone or whispering to my son Ethan. Every now and then, they exchanged glances that made me feel like an outsider sitting at my own table. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Grief has a way of making ordinary things seem darker than they really are. At least that's what I told myself. The roast chicken sat untouched on my plate. My appetite had disappeared sometime around the funeral. Every bite felt like chewing cardboard. Still, I forced myself to sit there because Richard always believed families should eat together, especially during difficult times. Your father always loved this recipe, I finally said, hoping to break the silence. Ethan nodded without looking up. Vanessa took a sip of wine. Neither of them responded. The room became quiet again. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked loudly enough to fill every corner of the house. Tick. 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 Each second felt heavier than the one before. Then Vanessa set down her glass. Deliberately. Slowly. As if she had rehearsed the moment. We need to talk about your future, she said. Something about her tone made my stomach tighten. I looked at Ethan. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. My future? I asked. What do you mean? Vanessa folded her hands together. Her smile never reached her eyes. This house is too much for one person. Especially someone your age. Someone your age. The words landed harder than she probably intended. Or perhaps exactly as she intended. I glanced around the dining room. Every photograph on the walls carried a memory. Ethan's high school graduation. Family vacations in Colorado. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across the floor. This wasn't just a house. It was a lifetime. I've managed this house for over 30 years, I replied calmly. I think I can continue managing it now. Vanessa exchanged another look with Ethan. That's not really the point, she said. The point is that it would make more sense for everyone if you moved somewhere smaller. Everyone. Not me. Everyone else. I suddenly realized this conversation had been planned long before dinner began. Maybe before the funeral. Maybe before Richard was even buried. Ethan finally cleared his throat. Mom, we're only trying to help. Help. Funny how that word can sound so different depending on who says it. I studied my son carefully. The little boy who used to run into my arms after school was gone. In his place sat a 42-year-old man who couldn't look his widowed mother in the eye. And where exactly would I go? I asked quietly. Vanessa answered before Ethan could speak. There are wonderful senior communities nearby. Activities. Social events. People your own age. Her voice sounded cheerful, almost excited. As though she were discussing vacation destinations instead of removing someone from her home. I felt something cold settle inside me. Not anger. Not yet. Something quieter. Something harder. I see, I said. Vanessa smiled. Good. Then we understand each other. But we didn't. Not at all. Because while they believed they were discussing my future, I was beginning to understand theirs. And for the first time that evening, I noticed something strange. Richard's office door was slightly open. Inside, a filing cabinet drawer stood half an inch wider than usual. Such a tiny detail. So small most people would never notice. But Richard and I had shared this house for 36 years. I noticed everything. And in that moment, as Vanessa continued explaining why I should leave, a single thought slipped quietly into my mind. Someone had been searching for something. I didn't know what. Not yet. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Richard had never left important matters unfinished. And whatever they believed they had already won, the story was far from over. That night, after Ethan and Vanessa went upstairs, I remained alone in the dining room for nearly an hour. The dishes sat untouched. The roast chicken had gone cold. The wine in Vanessa's glass reflected the chandelier light like a tiny pool of gold. Everything looked normal. That was the strange part. The house looked exactly the same, yet nothing felt the same anymore. Richard had been gone only 9 days, but somehow I already felt like a guest in my own home. Eventually I carried my plate to the kitchen and began washing dishes by hand. Richard always teased me about that. We had owned a dishwasher for 20 years, but I still preferred washing things myself. He used to stand beside me drying plates while telling stories about his day. The silence in the kitchen fell. The next morning, I woke after barely 2 hours of sleep. The sun was already shining through the bedroom curtains, casting pale strips of light across the floor. For a moment, I forgot everything. Then I looked toward Richard's empty side of the bed, and reality returned all at once. I dressed slowly and made my way downstairs. The smell of fresh coffee greeted me before I reached the kitchen. Vanessa was already there. She stood at the counter scrolling through her phone while sipping from one of Richard's favorite coffee mugs. Something about that small detail bothered me more than it should have. She glanced up when I entered. Her smile appeared instantly, but it felt practiced. Artificial. "Good morning," she said. I made coffee. I thanked her and poured myself a cup. Ethan joined us a few minutes later. He looked tired. Dark circles sat beneath his eyes. He kissed Vanessa on the cheek before sitting down at the table. Neither of them asked how I had slept. Neither mentioned Richard. Instead, they discussed home renovations. New flooring. Kitchen cabinets. Landscaping ideas. At first I assumed they were talking about their own house. Then Ethan unfolded a brochure showing renovation estimates for this house. My house. Richard's house. The realization settled heavily in my chest. They were already planning changes. Richard had not even been gone 2 weeks. That seems soon, I said quietly. Ethan froze. Vanessa set down her coffee cup. The silence lasted only a second, but it was enough. We are just exploring options, Vanessa replied smoothly. Nothing is decided. Yet the stack of brochures on the table suggested otherwise. I sipped my coffee and said nothing more. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions ever could. Later that afternoon, while Ethan and Vanessa went shopping, I returned to Richard's office. This time I searched more carefully. Every drawer. Every shelf. Every folder. I knew how organized Richard was. Small inconsistencies stood out immediately. Several documents had been moved recently. A few folders contained faint rectangular outlines where papers had once been stored. Whoever searched the cabinet had not been nearly as careful as they believed. Then I noticed something else. A legal folder labeled estate planning was missing entirely. I stared at the empty space for several moments. My pulse quickened. Richard updated our estate documents every few years. He believed in preparation. In clarity. In making sure family members never had to guess his wishes. The missing folder could not be a coincidence. I sat down and opened the desk drawer. Inside was Richard's old leather address book. Most of the numbers were outdated, but one entry caught my eye immediately. Martin Green. Attorney. I remembered Martin well. He had handled our legal affairs for nearly 15 years. Richard trusted him completely. I picked up the phone before I could talk myself out of it. Martin answered on the third ring. His voice sounded older than I remembered, but still steady. When I introduced myself, his tone softened immediately. He offered condolences and asked how I was holding up. I almost said I was fine. Instead, I told him the truth. I think something is wrong. There was a pause. Not a surprised pause. A thoughtful one. Can you come to my office tomorrow morning? He asked. There are a few things we should discuss in person. The words lingered in my mind long after the call ended. A few things we should discuss. Not might discuss. Should discuss. As evening approached, Ethan and Vanessa returned carrying shopping bags. They seemed unusually cheerful. Vanessa hummed while unpacking groceries. Ethan avoided looking at me altogether. During dinner, I noticed several whispered conversations stop whenever I entered the room. Their phones buzzed repeatedly. Each time, Vanessa checked the screen and quickly locked it again. The atmosphere felt different now that I had begun paying attention. Tiny details stood out everywhere. The exchanged glances. The unfinished